Okay, cool. Hey, it's
Yeah,
great to meet you. Thank you so much for taking a minute out for the show. I appreciate it.
thanks. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you bet. So let's get into your world of writing and everything that's kind of led up to who you are right now. And I want to ask you this. How much did COVID affect your creative process? And how many ripples has that created that you still feel today being through that pandemic?
Right. So COVID was a very tough time in my life and kind of a turning point. So right before COVID happened, I was a stay-at-home mom of an infant and a toddler. I'm still a stay-at-home mom, but my kids are older now.
Yeah.
And I was kind of going through a tough time just adjusting to being a mom of two and not really doing anything for myself. I wasn't writing at the time. I had given up writing for a couple of years, and basically just sacrificing all the time for my kids. And I wasn't very happy. Then COVID happened and I couldn't leave the house. I couldn't even, chat with random moms at the playground. It was just, me in my house all the time. So I realized that, because that was such a low point, that something had to change and that I would have to do something in my life, even if it was in quarantine, that would bring me joy and would, bring me peace and take up the space in my brain that was being taken up by worry, right? Because we were all worried during COVID. We were worried for our loved ones and for ourselves. And so I had to do some, reflecting, and I realized that I really missed writing, and that writing had always been a source of peace for me. Writing had always been something that had, like I said, taken up the space in my brain that was now being taken up by worries and things like that. So I started waking up early, like 5:30 in the morning, and writing before my kids woke up. And it really changed my whole approach. It changed, my mental health. It made me a lot happier and made me a better mom. And I'm still waking up early now, so the routine has stuck. So I think it really made me realize that I needed writing in my life.
What was the early book for you growing up? What was the one that really cemented your love of reading or wanting to become a writer?
So, I mean, I always loved reading. My mom taught me to read when I was 3. So I like cannot remember a time when I was not reading.
Yeah.
I wrote my first book when I was 5. It was 3 sentences long, but it was a book.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so I was always reading and writing growing up. One of my favorite books when I was young was Bridge to Terabithia by
Yeah.
Catherine Patterson.
Yeah.
Um, so that's the story, of two friends who have really big imaginations, and then one of them passes away as children. And it was a pretty heavy story for like a 10-year-old that I was at the time when I read it, but it was the first book that made me cry. So it was one of those books that, brought out so many emotions, and I realized how powerful writing could be, and that I really wanted to be able to evoke those kinds of emotions when I was writing.
Yeah. I remember when I was a kid, I was a big comic book fan, and there was a Spider-Man issue that came out, and one of the kids had leukemia. And
Wow.
Spider-Man really took care of him, but it showed him going to the hospital and he ended up dying. And I remember how powerful that is, you know? And then I happened when I was a teenager, I had a friend, one of my best friends growing up, had liver issues and was in and out of the hospital. And he used to hook up to an IV when we would be done playing outside. And it was just commonplace for
Wow.
me. And he ended up
Mhm.
passing away at 17 and I was 16. So yeah, it's weird how profound those things can shake your core, and leave a lasting imprint for sure. Um,
Yeah. I'm sorry to hear that. That's a lot to go through.
yeah, it's he visited me in dreams a lot, so we kept the dream alive for sure.
Mhm.
So I'm curious at this point in your life, if you were to go to a career day and you were in front of a bunch of third graders and they asked you what you do for a living, how would you answer them?
I would say that I write stories. So I write novels. They're for adults, but there's a lot of there are some moments, especially in my first novel, Games of Chance. It follows the characters from childhood to adulthood. So there is a lot about childhood and about adolescence in those books, but they are directed toward adults. Yeah, I write stories with really strong characters. So I like to say that I write character-driven fiction with an Italian-American spin. That's my little like tagline. So
Yeah.
both of the in both of my novels, the main characters are Italian American. So I talk a lot about that culture too, which is also my culture.
So, did you always want to be a writer when you were in the third grade? Was that your dream to grow up and to be a writer?
Well, I was always writing, but it was always like something that I did alongside everything else. I think in third grade, I would say I probably wanted to be an actress. I was really into theater. And that was kind of my dream for like during my childhood was to become an actress. But I think that doing theater and embodying different characters actually has helped me become a better writer because that's what you do in writing too. You embody different characters'
Yeah.
heads and thoughts and that kind of thing and the way they speak. So that influenced me too.
So give me a little idea of your family history. Where did your family come from in Italy, and what were some of the foundational elements that were planted into you to make reading a priority and to become a writer? How did that happen?
Yeah, so my parents are both Italian American, and from like the Naples area, and then also Molise, which is like the opposite coast of Naples. But they are, several generations back, so they didn't speak Italian. I did learn to speak Italian in college, and study there, which was great. So I got to reconnect with my heritage that way. Um, but I grew up in a very Italian American town, so like the food and the culture was a big part of how I grew up. And as you know, Italian Americans are very family centered, so we were all always together. We always had dinner together. And that's something that I reflect in my books, especially in Games of Chance, which is an Italian American family, that the siblings are always sticking up for each other. They always spend time together, and things like that. And as I mentioned before, growing up, my mom taught me to read at a very young age. And my parents were very encouraging people. They were always on board for whatever my brothers and I wanted to do. So my brothers were really into sports, so they got into sports. And I was into, like I said, theater and writing. And as a teenager, I wrote three young adult novels that I self-published. And my parents really spearheaded that process. They saw I was writing novels and they said, let's publish them. And back then, self-publishing was a lot more difficult than it is now. It's a totally different experience. So, but they believed in my work enough to do that. So, there was always people who were really supportive in my family.
My one half of my family came from Naples, and the other half came from Shaka, Sicily. That's actually where my last name comes from. So, yeah. Have you been to the old country? Have you been over there?
Yeah, so I studied in Italy in college in Bologna. And then I got to travel around. I got to go to Naples, which is a very unique place. It's very like gritty and chaotic. And it's like
Huh?
most people dream of Italy, they think of like Florence, right? And like all the pretty buildings and like the art. But like when I dreamed of Italy, like I kind of dreamed of Naples, like the chaos and the laundry hanging everywhere and like
Yep.
everybody on Vespas cutting you off. Like that was
Uh-huh.
Italy to me.
Yeah.
But yes, and so I've been a few times. I love Italy.
Yeah, I've been over there a few times. I was actually over there on 9/11. I was in the back of a water taxi in Venice, and
Oh,
a,
wow.
a guy was like, just like, I don't know. We just woke up and got on the taxi, and the guy's like, Nuevo York, and he's doing this with his arms. And I'm like, are you talking about the 93 incident? What are you talking about? Because when I travel, when I backpacked, I just like, I didn't call home much. I was in the moment. So I called home. And my dad, being a native New Yorker, he was like, one of the towers just fell. And I'm like, what do you mean, tower? What are you talking about? And then he told me, and I was like, I had just been to New York a few years before and saw the towers, and I was like, how was that even possible? So anyway, that just produced a scramble to find my way back to America because my flight didn't exist, and that it's like being in Italy and being over there because I ended after I went to Venice, I went to. Are you familiar with Cinque Terre, the poor man's Riviera?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I went to
Um,
Vernazza. So it's like an old hippie commune, and it
okay.
was like the perfect place to be if there was any place on the planet. So it was a wild time for sure. So um
Yeah, I have one of my characters in Games of Chance travel to Italy because I was so moved by my own travels there and finding I found my cousins over there too,
yeah.
and they were so welcoming and treated me like like I was their daughter, and so I felt like I needed to, reflect that in writing too.
So the one thing my dad wanted me to do when I went out there, he said, when you find a phone book, I want you to rip out the page that has the names Dimino on it and bring it back to me. Which wouldn't happen now because it was like, I mean, this was in 2000, so it was on the cusp of going digital, but I had just pages and pages of all the places. So
Wow.
whoever lives in those towns are like, why the hell did this dude take the D's out of here?
That's so
So,
funny.
so I'm curious, what was the first thing that you wrote that you showed to somebody or they read where they loved it and you felt validation and you were like, wow, this is what I should do?
Oh, that's a good question. I like that. Um, well, I wrote a lot of short stories when I was younger. And I would share them with friends and they, were excited about them, but of course they were my friends and everything too. But I do remember I wrote a novel in high school that I never finished it. But the two main characters eventually became the characters in Games of Chance. So I kept those characters alive. Um, but while I was writing it, I was kind of sharing like a chapter at a time with my one friend who was, really into reading too. And she was so hooked into this story, and she'd be like, I have to know what happens next. And we would talk about it, but I'm like, I can't give you spoilers. And it was like almost like we were having this experience of the story unfolding together. And that was really exciting to me. So I mean, I think I'm pretty lucky to have usually had positive feedback from the people that I'm around. Obviously, I've been in creative writing classes and had criticism, and I've had criticism, with editing and everything like that. But when you see somebody just excited about something you came up with in your own head, it makes you more excited about it too.
For sure. Who's been that hero, that inspiration for you, whether it's in writing or otherwise in your life?
I would say that I don't know that I've had a specific hero as much as I've had supporters. Like I said, when I was young, my parents were always ready to do whatever crazy idea I had. I had my grandma who I remember being like 4 or 5, and I would go to her house for dinner, and she would set the table for my imaginary friends too, because
Oh, cool.
I had all these imaginary friends. And I'd be like, oh, Teresa's coming over, and she would set a plate for Teresa, even though Teresa wasn't real.
Yeah.
So like people always encouraged me to express myself. And now my husband's like that too. I mean, he doesn't set a table for my imaginary friends, but
Yeah.
he's very encouraging and like listens to when I need to talk about my writing. And whenever I feel down, he's always the person who encourages me to keep going. So I've been lucky that way to have a lot of people who help me believe in myself.
So if you could meet an author that's alive on the planet right now that you love, that you find fascinating, and you could spend some time with them, ask them some questions, who would that be?
Ooh, that's a good one. And they have to be alive.
No, we can do the ghosts. We can open the door up.
Okay. Because there's a lot of authors that I like nowadays too, but the one that I would really love to meet if I could raise the dead would be Betty Smith, who wrote A Tree Grows in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Um, that book found me at the right time in my life where I was writing games of chance, but I was kind of like not sure if it was going to go anywhere because I was like, this is just a story about a family and about kids growing into adults. Does anyone want to read this? It's not an exciting plot or whatever. And then I read A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, which is really about a girl growing up in Brooklyn, about the neighborhood, about the flavors and the sounds and the people and all the little stories that go on. And it's not so plot driven. And I love that book. And it inspired me to say that these stories that are about characters are really, worth writing. And then I read a lot of her other work, and she writes very honestly about motherhood and, pregnancy and nursing and all these different things that, aren't considered like classical literature kind of topics, but she writes about them so beautifully and really made me feel seen. So I would love to chat with her.
So do you ever get writer's block?
Yeah, definitely. When I'm in the middle of a story, if I'm stuck, my strategy is I just have to keep going. Like I have to
Yeah.
keep sitting down
Uh-huh.
and writing, even if you're just against a brick wall, just write whatever you can. But after I finished my most recent novel, Like a Mom, um, I was struggling for a while to come up with a new idea because Like a Mom, the idea hit me like in the middle of writing Games of Chance, and it was very compelling. It's a love story between a writer and a musician who
Yeah.
are raising a blended family. So it was this really great character-driven story, a love story. And after I finished, I was a little bit lost on what to do next. So one of the things I actually did, which I've never done before, believe it or not, in my whole life, was look up writing prompts online.
Yeah.
And a lot of them, and I would just be like, okay, today I'm writing for this prompt. And a lot of stuff came out that was crap. But I had one prompt that actually produced a short story, and another prompt that led me to the story that I'm writing right now. So the novel I'm writing now.
So do you sometimes step back and think about these stories that you've written and you're like, wow, I just can't remember where that came from. Do you have a hard time kind of connecting how all that worked?
Sometimes it's funny, like when I read something that I wrote, it feels like somebody else wrote it,
Yeah.
right? And even if somebody gives me feedback and they're like, I love the scene where whatever, whatever, I'm like, I love that too. Like as if we were talking about something we read together.
Yeah.
So there is a strange detachment, but I do remember, the seeds of what created each story, and I remember the process, but it feels like otherworldly, like it happened to
Yeah.
someone else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, there's all this advice that people give to writers and how they're, supposed to administer it and longevity and all these things. What's the best advice you've ever gotten as a writer?
Um, I would say the best advice was actually given by someone who's not a writer and was not talking about creative writing. Just had a professor in college who was talking to us about he had to sign some crazy paper and everyone was complaining. And he was like, listen, you guys, all you do is waste time talking about the paper, thinking about the paper, sitting in the chair saying, why do I have to write this paper? Just write the paper.
Yeah.
Just get in the space and just do it. And that is like the best advice I've heard from writing about writing because it's the same way with creative writing. Like you think about it, you dread it, or you look forward to it, or whatever you're doing, but you're not just sitting there typing the words.
Yeah.
That's where the work is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the best advice I've ever heard is just write every day. Whatever you do, no matter what you do, write every day. And that way you
Hmm.
get into a habit because it's like that 90 day principle. After 90 days, it becomes a habit. And then Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours, it become a master at it. It's like if you just practice and practice, like a musician practicing all the time, it's just that's how it works. So I'm
Definitely.
curious if you had a dream tonight, you ran into the version of you before you published your first book, and you could give that young version of you a piece of advice based on this life you've led, the wisdom you've accumulated, what advice would you impart on that young version of you?
That's interesting. I think I would say a couple things. First of all, that the path to succeeding at what you want to do is never straight. And if anyone tells you, like, you have to do X, Y, Z to achieve this, they're wrong. They might be saying this out of the goodness of their heart and trying to help, but the path is never straightforward and it's different for everyone.
Yeah,
So don't measure your success against somebody else's. And also don't take setbacks as a sign that, like, this is wrong for you and you can't do it, because everybody has setbacks. Everybody has bad writing days. Everybody has bad reviews and all of that. It's not a measure of, whether you should be doing this. If you feel in your heart that you have to write this story, then you have to write the story. That's what
yeah,
matters.
yeah. So, of all of these things that you've done and accomplished, what are you the proudest of?
Definitely my kids.
Yeah,
So I have, like I said, two kids, and they're both very creative as well. They write stories too, and they like to, paint and do music and drawing and everything like that. And they're kind people, and that's really where most of my energy goes, is to making to my kids, making sure that they're happy and that they grow up to be good people. So yeah.
so at the end of the day, everyone has a perception of you, family, friends, fans, everyone that knows you. But who do you think you are? What's your perception of you?
So I actually have a funny story kind of related to that, and then I'll get into my answer. When my daughter was in preschool, they made Mother's Day cards, and on the cards, they had to answer like little questions about their mom, like my mom's eyes are brown, and my mom likes to write or whatever. And one of the things was my mom is blank, and you had to put an adjective. And she had written silly. And this was really heartwarming for me because, at the time I was thinking, like, I'm the nervous mom. I'm always the one who's running here and running there and saying, don't do that, watch that, like scared of everything. But I also was the person who was like sitting on the floor with her, acting out some crazy character from a TV show and being goofy. And to her, like, that's what she was thinking of when she associated mom. Mom's the silly one who plays with me, not mom is stressed out.
Yeah,
So that made me, realize that, like, maybe the perception of me is not what I'm thinking in my head.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, and other than that, I would say that the way I see myself is very creative, and someone who encourages creativity in other people, in my kids. Like, my house is full of drawings all over the wall, in my friends, and someone who's very emotional, which makes for very authentic writing, but also maybe makes me kind of like a lot of ups and downs during the day for the people
yeah.
close to me. But yeah.
Yeah, I got the Italian blood. I understand how that works. It's kind of a part of it's a part of the nature. I totally get it. So yeah.
Yes.
So let me ask you this. If anyone wants to reach out and get your books, they want to reach out to you, any news in your world, where's the best place for them to go?
Sure. So my website is raqueldrosos.com. And that's where you can sign up for my newsletter. I have a free short story that I only offer in my newsletter, so you can get that. And you can also buy Games of Chance and Like a Mom there. They're available on Amazon, Barnes& and Noble, Apple, but all the links are right on my website.
Okay, excellent. Raquel, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for your story. Thank you for your time. Have a great holiday season and a great 2025.
Thank you, you too.
Cool. Thank you.